Your speech in the House of Commons left people, you hope, with what impression?
Well, a clear concern about whether this trial got it right. You know, I mean, way back when in June, when I first really looked at it properly, I mean, up until then, sure, this girl was a monster who'd killed 7 kids and tried to kill lots more. You know, that was where I was until somebody called me up from America and said, have you seen this article in the New Yorker? Now, the New Yorker, you'll know, Tom, is famous for its research and its fact-checking. I know it's not fashionable these days, but for its fact-checking. And so I looked at this 13,000-word article. Well, the first thing was I couldn't actually get it because it was blocked online by court order, right?
In the UK?
In the UK. Yeah. But I managed to get a copy sent to me. I read it, and it was sort of worrying, put it that way. I mean, every piece, there's a huge amount of so-called evidence in this court case, and it went through pretty much all of it and showed, in its view, it was fallacious. So I raised this question in the House of Commons the next day and said, why is it blocked? And out of that single 30-second question, I got 16 experts get in touch with me, and they range from a past president of the Royal Statistical Society, a current chairman of one of the Economic and Social Research Councils, a past president of the Royal College of Paediatric and Child Healthcare, members of public inquiries in this sort of area. And I thought, well, this is not your normal sort of conspiracy theory pylon. This is actually people who know what they're talking about. And each of them said, it was very interesting, each of them said to me, in their area, my bit's wrong. I can't speak for the others, but my bit's wrong. So the senior statistician, well, I can tell you, it's Peter Green, he actually went public afterwards, and he said, well, the statistical stuff is nonsense. Right. And then the neonatologist said the neonatal stuff. So that's where it started. And as a result of that, I thought, crikey, this is very likely a mistrial. But the thing to understand is that mistrials aren't always miscarriages of justice. Sometimes they get the right answer by the wrong method, you know. So I spent 3 months over the course of summer, immediately after the election. We couldn't get the transcript. When we rang up
from court,
the Manchester Crown Court, they said, that's £100,000, please. They dropped the price later to 10,000, but I can't afford that either. So initially we couldn't get the transcript. So we went through every day's reporting, right, by the local paper and by the BBC continuous Twitter stream and so on. And I was looking for a slam dunk. I thought, you know, if she's guilty of any one of these things and there's clear evidence of it, I'll drop it because I don't want to get into this. And I couldn't find any such thing. Indeed, the more I looked at it, the more doubt I had. And that's what started me on the route that led to the debate last week.
I'll come to what you said on the floor of the Commons in a moment, because some of the details are absolutely astonishing. Details I didn't know, and very grim.
I'll warn your audience. Yes, and grim. Yeah.
And critically, the details that were available before the court case took place were not, you say, available in the courtroom for the jury to hear, which is astonishing. But come back to the slam dunk bit. The slam dunk bit is the note she wrote saying, I'm evil, I did this.
Well, no, it isn't, because this was a load of Post-it notes, and her counsellor, I guess her psychiatric counsellor, but all I've got in my notes is counsellor. Her counsellor told her to write down all her thought process as a way of expunging the depression and fear and so on she must have felt when she was on suspension, right? And later on, in that same stream of notes is, why is this happening to me? I've done nothing wrong. In the same stream, all right? So she's going through this thought process. And of course, prosecution didn't read that bit out. He just read the first bit out. And one of the problems in this whole thing is the way the trial was structured. I mean, for perfectly understandable reasons from a prosecution's point of view, their job is to get a conviction. There was a huge sort of confirmatory bias. From about day 3, I think the jury were probably persuaded, most of them, of this, of her guilt. And then everything was confirmatory bias. If it sounded like... I mean, let me give you another example. She had a whole load of handover notes at home, right? Now, if you found a nurse, you didn't know anything else, you found a nurse that had a whole load of handover notes at home, in the nurse's home, you'd think, well, she's very conscientious. But instead, this was interpreted as, her collecting trophies, which frankly is nonsense, but nevertheless that's the way it's seen.
All of this could point to the fact that maybe her lawyers were terrible. Well, and if you've got terrible lawyers and you lose the case, Is that justice?
Well, that's the problem. I said this in the debate. The difficulty is that if the evidence that is brought to try and get an appeal has been available to your lawyers at the beginning, it's hard luck. You're going to be banged up for life. There's nothing you can do about it because that's the sort of rule. And it's been around for a long time. But that's not justice. In my view, that's not justice. Indeed, I think you have to be particularly careful in whole life cases because you are destroying somebody's life with this. They can't have children, they can't get married, they can't do anything, and that's the end of their real life. So I think you've got to be very careful about it. And one of the things I want to see is a review of the Court of Appeal rules.
So what evidence was available before the trial but was not heard in court? And why wasn't it heard in court?
Well, a couple of things.
What are the big ones that you think are important?
I'm trying to pick out the biggest three for you. Number one was that the police initially employed a professor of statistics from Warwick and asked her advice. What's the odds of somebody being on 7 out of, or 8 out of 18 or 7 out of 17 cases?
She was in the hospital. She was working on those days.
Actually in the hospital. Not necessarily working on the cases,
no,
but in the hospital. That's an important distinction. And she said, well, that's the whole wrong way to go about it. You've got to look at alternative risks. You've got to look at the level of risk to the child, level of care, all these things, which came up later. And when the police put that to the prosecutors, in effect, the prosecutors came back and said, drop that professor, right? Ignore that advice, right?
Can prosecutors say that?
Well, they're not allowed to. Article 3.3 of the CPS code says you can't instruct the police, and other policemen have said they wouldn't have taken the instruction. But that's on record. That is, and the reason I say it's on record is because that professor had an email from the police from the police telling her that they were terminating her, as it were. So that's one. But then, so the statistical arguments fall to pieces, and that's what the statistical arguments fall to pieces, and that's really what Peter Green, the ex-head of the Royal Statistical Society, and a number of other senior statisticians have said it's just flawed. Then you come to the reason for the what is seen as the diagnosis that renders these deaths as murders. That's an important difference of view. And there's a lot of evidence historically around the world in Netherlands and Italy and so on, of nurses being convicted of killing children who died from natural causes. There's even a case in Britain with Sally Clark, with a mother.
Yes.
In this, the evidence of a man called Dr. Dow Evans was very important. And in essence, he suggested 3 causes of death: injecting air into the stomach, injecting air into the veins, and air embolism, and insulin injection. Those are the 3 causes. We haven't, because of the cases we looked at so far, we haven't really focused on the insulin. We'll come into that later. But firstly, a lot of neonatologists just dismissed the injection of air into the stomach. They said babies get air in their stomach a lot, and the trick is to get the air out. It's not, it's not a method of killing. But what's happened, which led to my debate, was 2 very expert neonatologists, one of them actually a member of a national inquiry, looked again at the detailed case notes, of which there are large amounts.
But that's I want to come to that. But that's happened subsequently. That's happened after the trial.
Well, except the case notes were available at the time, of course.
Right. And were the case notes available in full in court?
Not to the jury, no, not in court. They just weren't used. It comes back to this issue of whether or not the defence did a good job, and I don't know the answer to that. But they decided not to deploy their own expert to give evidence.
So no case notes available.
I assume he would have done that.
No full case notes of these children were not available. No. I mean, you say in the debate that it was known at the time that in this neonatal unit, in fact in the hospital, but specifically in the neonatal unit, there was an infection rolling around that could in theory have been responsible for deaths of children and was certainly likely to make children very ill.
Yeah, it's called Pseudomonas. Pseudomonas arugensis is the Pseudomonas, and amongst neonates, his death rate can be higher than 55%.
And this is happening in the hospital.
They had the water.
concurrently?
It was in the water. We don't know of any direct infection, but it was in the water, and they couldn't get rid of it. And it wasn't. I mean, it only came out because of a leak after the trial. You know, a leak of the information after the trial.
But the hospital will have known that was happening at the time.
Hospital would have known. I assume. The doctors who made the accusations would have known, because they were trying to stamp this out, and that could have had, because bear in mind, this all starts with a spike in deaths, an increase in deaths, and it could have been one of the contributory reasons.
And as you say, none of this is to suggest in your mind that Lucy Letby is innocent. As you say, they might have come to the right conclusion, but through the wrong method. But you're saying that this is a mistrial because the available evidence, even at the time, let alone new evidence that emerged, the evidence at the time of the trial was not heard in court, was not presented to the jury.
Let's be clear, I do think it's a miscarriage, and the reason I say that is because I think the probability of the other reasons for death is much, much higher than the idea that a young woman who'd taken up nursing as a career suddenly became a murderer.
The statistics that will be debated very keenly. You mentioned Dewey Evans, Dr. Dewey Evans, who you say has changed his mind a number of times. He denies that, but he was very critical in giving the statistical evidence that possibly allowed the jury to come to the conclusion that they did. I mean, this is very complicated.
Yes.
Very complicated stuff.
Yes.
The police struggle with this stuff. Prosecutors might struggle with. Do you think of a case of this seriousness or cases of this seriousness, actually a jury trial is the right way of going about this? That 12 men and women who are picked from the community, go and give up their services, are the right people to actually judge?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think the failure in this is the court failure, the judiciary, rather than the jurors. Because at the end of the day, the question is the question to be answered is straightforward. Did this person kill these children? It's how the evidence is presented. Now, there was back in 2011, there was a Law Commission report into expert evidence, and it said that it's very difficult to get impartial expert evidence under the current system. What happens now is the police go out and find somebody and employ them. So Mr. Evans, Dr. Evans, I beg his pardon, Dr. Evans was employed by the police. Now, I'm afraid, you know, you have to be inhuman for that not to put some pressure on you towards a certain attitude. And he actually said to the private eye doctor that he'd won 34 out of 35 cases. That mindset's the wrong one for a court. I can understand it. You know, he's employed by the prosecutors, but the court should have somebody completely impartial, and we haven't fixed that since 2011.
But you still have faith in the jury system.
Yeah.
Even with very complicated, very difficult statistical analysis.
Let me tell you why in 30 seconds. One of the most complicated financial cases we ever had was the Jubilee line fraud case. And because it fell to pieces, we were able to interview the jurors. It's illegal to interview jurors normally, but we were able to interview jurors. And everybody thought, oh, well, this is so complicated you can't understand it. And the jurors said, no. So we could understand it. The trouble was with the lawyers in the court. They couldn't explain it properly. We understood exactly what was going on. And I think the jury is much more robust than you think, so long as the case is presented accurately and clearly. And both of those things, accuracy and clarity, were missing in this.
Have you spoken with Lucy Letby?
No. And there's a reason for that. I mean, look, I will gain nothing from such an interview. I know some psychopaths who are very charming, and I know some innocent people who've been
Probably been in cabinet with them.
Well, you were there. And I also know some people who've been wrongly convicted who can't meet your eyes. So it doesn't make any difference from my judgment, and it might have raised her hopes unnecessarily. I don't want to make her torture any worse.
So would you be open to visiting her in prison or speaking to her at all?
Maybe at some point, but it's not contributory to this process. So I've got to be as almost cold-blooded. I've got to be as analytical as possible in this. I've got to be open to any evidence that comes up. And that's why I spent the 3 months pouring through all this. I tell you, I could have had a much pleasanter 3 months in the summer, but that's why I did it.
got two cases that you have looked at specifically
Yeah.
with independent neonatologists and experts who have gone back over the case notes
Yeah.
to see what might have been missed. Cases of baby O and baby C.
Yeah.
Briefly, what do those findings now suggest could have happened to those children?
Well, in the case of baby O, what Dr. Evans said was there are two possibilities. One's nasogastric air. I think he changed his mind a bit later on that. And the other one was trauma to the liver, bruising and trauma to the liver. What it transpired actually happened was that the doctors put too much high pressure into the ventilation, the breathing support system. That pushed all of the innards down into the liver and the other parts into the abdomen. They then thought that it literally had gasonastric, what they call splinting, stopping it breathing. They put a needle into the abdomen to let the air out, put it in the wrong side of the abdomen, punctured the liver, caused serious bleeding, and at least one of the post-mortems attributed cause of death to that. So the cause was an error by the doctor. He didn't do it deliberately. It was an error by the doctor. Nothing by the nurses at all. An error by the doctor. So that was one. The other one was baby C, which Dr. Evans said was healthy or well. I'm not quite sure which of those words he used, but basically well. It was anything but. This is an 800-gram baby. It had to be delivered by cesarean, 1 3/4 pounds in old money, my old money. Tiny, tiny baby. Had to be delivered by cesarean section, really to keep it alive by the sounds of it. It had problems in the womb. It had serious parenteral problems, the feed from the mum to it. And it, in essence, it was having trouble breathing, had respiratory problems. They put the tube into its mouth. The doctor put it too far in, went into the lungs. So when they were trying to feed surfactant, this is like a sort of detergent to make the lungs open up, pop open, as it were, post-birth. Only went into one lung, and so the baby was operating on one lung, and eventually it just didn't have enough oxygen for its brain. And so the point about these two stories is they're the real reasons for death. They don't rely on statistics. They don't rely on theories that you've read in a paper from 20 years ago. They rely on the facts in the case notes. This was actually
that's going to be my question. This isn't another expert coming in. These are the notes that exist anyway within the hospital that has pointed these experts to conclude that these deaths were quote unquote natural. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they also say arising from suboptimal care. That's their phrasing. Yeah. And bear in mind, I am not a doctor. I am taking the expertise of really, really high-class neonatal specialists on this, and that's the conclusion they came to.
Were the case notes? The case notes weren't available in court, were they?
No, why would you? You're talking
but,
hundreds of pages of things. You wouldn't do that. You would present the interpretation. And what Dr. Evans
why didn't her defence team present this interpretation?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I have spoken to the medical expert who they would have used. He doesn't know the answer either. So.
You say in one of the cases, forgive me, I can't remember whether it was baby O or baby C, but in one of these cases, Lucy Letby wasn't actually on the ward at all.
That's right. From the point of, I think it was baby C, from the point of birth right up until there was an X-ray, which is the basis of Evans's diagnosis.
She injected air into the child.
That's right, and she wasn't there until then. She was there for the very last moments of his life, as it were, but that was the very last shift.
Yeah. What's the next step? What's the thing that you need to see happen next, do you think?
Well, there's 5 more cases to go through, which are going to come in terms of what I'm doing. But the next step in legal terms is her lawyer is now reapplying to the Court of Appeal for permission to appeal. And later on, from after that, certainly if it doesn't succeed, he'll apply to a thing called the CCRC, the Criminal Case Review Commission, who look back at these things. And one of the points I was making in the debate is the last high-profile case that CCRC did was a man called Andrew Malkinson, who was convicted of rape. Then within 4 years of him going to prison, they found DNA evidence which exculpated him. It proved it.
We've had him on, yeah. We've talked to him.
You have.
A horrendous story.
And it was 13 more years before they came to the case. Now, Lucy Letby, you referred to her Post-it notes. One of the things she said in the Post-it notes, I'm never going to get married, I'm never going to have children, right? Well, I got that sort of praise on my mind a bit. And my last line was, I want to really, if she's found to be innocent, and I'm not talking about a pardon, I'm talking about a retrial, so we come back over all this data again, by real experts, the best in the country, frankly. And if at the end of that they find her not guilty, I want her out in her 30s, not in her 50s, because the size of that miscarriage will be just unbelievable if it lasts that long. And understand, Tom, this is not the only case. There's a lady called Lucy Letby in Netherlands, almost the same. The Sally Clark here, which we've had, there they said the odds were some millions to one. It was rubbish. And we've had a case of a lady called Poggia in Italy in 2021. All exonerated, every single one exonerated. So we need to look at this and we need to learn a lesson from it. One, for the legal system, but two, for the NHS. Because there were 3 other hospitals with roughly similar spikes in the years before and after, right? We don't want to find ourselves scapegoating nurses when there's some other potential cause, whether it's a superbug, whether it's a level of resources, a level of training. I don't know the answer to that, but it's much, much more likely to be those than it is a nurse suddenly going off the rails.
You mentioned Andrew Malkinson. Yeah. You mentioned other miscarriages of justice. I mean, you think of the biggest, gravest in this country, Birmingham Six. Where would this sit? If you're right, where would this sit?
In terms of individual miscarriage of justice, right near the top. I mean, because there are 2 elements of miscarriage of justice. One is the denial of your freedom. The other is the destruction of your name. And this has been monstrous in both counts. 17 or whatever it is, 14 whole life sentences, and seen by everybody as a monster. I mean, monster. In terms of size of miscarriage, well, the postmasters is large numbers of people who've had their lives destroyed. So that's probably
but
in
breach
absolute
of trust. People's breach of trust in the justice system.
Yeah. Well, look, you will not have in your studio anybody who's fought harder than me for the rule of law in the UK, for protection of the jury system. I've had those battles way back when, for stopping the state locking people up for 90 days, you name it. I've fought harder for it.
You and Jeremy Corbyn there together talking about...
Oddly enough, on Julian Assange. Actually, it was with Jeremy Corbyn, ironically. But the simple truth is that we only defend it because it's a good justice system. And generally speaking, by comparison with the rest of the world, it's a good justice system. But it's not perfect. And it's our duty, my duty. I work in the supposedly most senior court in the land, in Parliament. It's my duty and duty of people like me to make sure that when something goes wrong with it, we get it put right. So the 2011 recommendation on the whole question of expert witnesses, we should put into law. Why we haven't done it for 15 years, I don't know. The issue of what the Court of Appeal can take into account, we should put that right. It's not justice. It's judicially convenient, but it's not justice. And also, frankly, in the National Health Service, I mean, look, we had mid-staffs onwards. All these cases have gone wrong. And what do we find? More often than not, the whistleblower gets scapegoated, and the people who've really made the mistake go off and get promoted to some trust somewhere else, which we've seen too often as well. We got 3 big issues to solve, as well as the miscarriage out of this, all of which will make all of our national institutions better. And that's, after all, what we're here about.